Good evening. Wow. That is really fun to get an applause for saying good evening. I think that let's remember to do that more often. Thank you. So, welcome to everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I'm Caroline Staten, Executive Director of Transition US. Woo! And thank you for joining us on the opening of the very first Transition US National Gathering, first of many, I hope. And thanks so much for joining us on what promises to be a really, really riveting evening. And for those of you that have been attending the conference so far, how has it been? I mean, really good, hasn't it? Yeah. So far we've had 2 days of day-long or 2-day intensives, and they wrapped up today. We had 6 different great sessions going strong. And then coming up, we have the main conference, and this is what's kicking it off, this event tonight. And I'll tell you more about the main conference in a little while. So first I wanted just to orient you to those of you that might not know about the global transition movement and the phenomenon that it has turned into. And it started as a teacher-student project, and they were looking at, what would our community look like if we really reduced our dependence on fossil fuels? And that was in Kinsale, Ireland. And 2005, Michael, thank you. And now it's spread all over the world. So it's in more than 50 countries: Croatia, Latvia, the Philippines, Japan, Argentina, Colombia, Mexico, Canada, US, and most of the European countries. South Africa as well. So it's really had a phenomenal growth. And I wanted to just insert something here because one fact, one awesome catalyst of it across the world is our speaker tonight, Richard Heinberg. So he really took it and seeded it in a number of places, and you're responsible for a lot of this stuff, Richard. So today's transition efforts started as that student project, as I said, but they've really evolved into a number of different things. They look really different in different places. So some examples are, in Transition Sarasota, they've done an amazing gleaning project, and they've got a lot of attention about this. So over several years, they've gleaned over 270,000 pounds of food for their local food bank. I mean, it's an exceptional amount of food that they have. They've provided a lot of organic produce, that would have gone to waste. So that's one project, just to give some flavors. And we have some wonderful women here who will be talking about the Free Store in Media, Pennsylvania. So they started a Free Store. And of course, you can come and you can take away things that fit in your arms. But what also happens is a lot of conversation happens and a lot of community gets built. And in Belfast, Maine, they had a problem with a lot of power outages a few winters ago. So they made a warming hut. And there's always a hot pot of soup on, and it's got so many ways of power generation that they don't lose power. And there's a quiet room where students can do their homework, and there's just all sorts of opportunities, again, to connect. And in Pasadena, we'll be hearing about the Pasadena Repair Cafe. And a wonderful little piece of that is The Repair Cafe is people that really are good at fixing things and people that bring everything from their toaster or whatever. And one person got their toaster fixed by somebody who had worked on the Mars rover. So there's a lovely conversation that is happening there too. So I think transition is about seeing where the needs are and seeing what you can do in these sweet, clever, beautiful ways to really knit community together. And what is common around all of these is that communities aren't waiting for governments to do it for them. They aren't doing it alone because that's so friggin' lonely and we've got enough of that in the world. But they're getting together with their neighbors and their communities and they're saying, what do we want in this place that we love and cherish? And how can we make it more resilient? And that's sort of the glue, and people move from there and make these remarkable things happen like those examples I just gave. So without further ado, we're going to move into our program. And I just wanted to give you a little taste of what we've got. I'm going to ask Leslie Mackenzie to come to the stage in a moment. And she's going to introduce two of our local stars. Christy Manning and Ann Hunt are going to talk a bit about what's happening here in your place. And then Leslie will be introducing Richard, and we'll close out the night with some Q&A. So I wanted to also just say before Leslie comes on the stage, why are we having the first Transition National Gathering in St. Paul? Well, because of Leslie Mackenzie, Michael Russell, and the Twin Cities Transition Group. So we as organizers hadn't been here before. We were organizing this at a distance with these people on the ground doing so much work, finding this great location, and just really making it happen. And it's because of their fortitude and their effort and their passion that we are here, all of us, tonight. So thank you so much, Leslie, and come on up.
Thank you so much. So welcome to the Twin Cities, everyone. We're really happy to be your hosts, and we're happy to be your students as we come together this weekend for all of us to learn from each other about all the amazing work that's been happening all over the country. I'm Leslie Mackenzie. I'm one of the organizers of Transition Longfellow. We have a poster board in the back about my group, and I'm the coordinator of Transition Twin Cities, which is a hub group for the 6 transition groups that exist in the Twin Cities. And Michael Russell, wherever he is, in the back, is with Transition All St. Anthony Park, and they're very tricky. It's Transition ASAP. So, the Transition Twin Cities works to raise the visibility of transition and its work to promote carbon reduction, climate resilience, and economic relocalization. I also help to start new groups. So one of the new groups that's forming is forming right here at McAllister. And it's a pretty special group because it's going to combine the knowledge that exists within the academic community here with the enthusiasm and creativity of young people and the skills and resources of the community. So it's really knitting together, just like Rob Hopkins had suggested would be the perfect way to start a group. So they're doing their first kickoff event September 30th. If you are in the Twin Cities, we're going to do a day of Skillshares here on campus on September 30th. McAllister is a wonderful location for our first gathering, not only because of the beautiful campus and nice facilities, but also because of its commitment to going zero waste. So wherever you are on campus, you'll see lots of opportunities to put your trash in just the right place, including compost. And because of the work of some of its faculty, and I'm going to specifically mention Christy Manning and Rupali Phadke. These professors partnered with the City of St. Paul and the Science Museum of Minnesota to do groundbreaking work on climate preparedness in low-income communities in the Twin Cities. So I'm pleased to have a chance to introduce Professor Christy Manning from Macalester and Ann Hunt, Environmental and Sustainability Coordinator with the City of St. Paul, so that they can tell us a little bit more about that work.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Macalester. I'm Christy Manning, and I have the honor of representing Macalester at the kickoff of this lovely gathering. I teach environmental studies and psychology right here in Olin Rice Hall. And I wanted to say before I turn it over to Anne, that I really think Macalester is a wonderful host for the transition gathering for the reasons that Leslie mentioned, our goals to reach zero waste, carbon neutrality, many other goals that we have for environment and social justice. Those are some of our pillars here at Macalester. I also want to note that much of the work we do, Macalester, one of its pillars is service to society, and we have a very strong civic engagement center. So much of the work that we as faculty do with our students in the classroom is to bring them out into the community. And a lot of the projects we do are very much in the spirit of transition. And in fact, Hala, I'm going to call you out because just to tell you how perfect Macalester is a location, I loaned this book to one of my students sometime during the semester, and here she is tonight, and she brought it back and said, oh, by the way, I'm returning your book, the Transition Handbook. So it really is a great place. These conversations are happening here already. The student energy is high, and we are making things happen. So one specific project that I've been involved in, Leslie mentioned, is called Ready and Resilient St. Paul. It's a collaboration between Macalester, my colleague Rupali and I, and our students, the Science Museum of Minnesota, Anne, and the Mayor's Office of St. Paul, and then 5 different communities that Anne and the Mayor helped us identify for their higher vulnerability to the impacts of climate change, largely due to poverty, but other factors, such as these were communities where there was a higher turnover rate, a lot of renters and people were moving in and out. There was a high number of marginalized members of the community, racial minorities, ethnic minorities, new immigrants, a lot of new immigrants to the Twin Cities. And these were communities that the city of St. Paul was having a hard time establishing communication channels with. So we partnered with leaders in these neighborhoods, these 5 different neighborhoods, and with their help, we organized a community meeting in each one of those 5 communities. And this was in 2014, and we continued the work through 2016. We brought 15 to 20 residents together in each community to talk about their concerns about climate change impacts, and then to brainstorm and prioritize the kinds of solutions that they felt were appropriate for their neighborhood to help them become ready and resilient for climate change. One of the main goals of our project was to help create the social infrastructure, to seed the community with the tools that they needed to work together with the ear of the mayor's office, with the help of the mayor's office, to make their communities ready and resilient to climate change impacts. Our partners and the residents came up with brilliant ideas during these community meetings. They were very specific to the particular neighborhood. We had very little overlap between the communities. They met each other, they created bonds, and much of that work continued into the following year. In fact, we were shocked when out of the 70 people who attended across all of our meetings, at the end of the summer when we had a listening session with Ann Hunt and Mayor Coleman and other city leaders, about 2/3 of our community members came out on a weekday night with no incentive to be part of this listening session where they could share their ideas with the city. So we are now taking this work a little bit further in collaboration with Anne and others at the City of St. Paul. We're updating a handbook called Ready and Resilient St. Paul. I just got a copy of it in my inbox today at 5 p.m. from the student who's working on it. And we're hoping to continue these collaborations with these connections that we have built. So I will turn it over to Anne to tell her side of the story from the city perspective, but there's an example of some of the work we're doing here at Macalester with the help of our students in the community to move all of us toward readiness and resilience for climate change transition.
Well, thank you, Christy. On behalf of Mayor Chris Coleman, I want to welcome you all to St. Paul. Thank you very much for being here. Mayor Coleman was elected 12 years ago and had prioritized then and continues to prioritize climate change as one of the key issues that he wanted to address at a local level. So this has been, at the time he was elected, he felt that there wasn't leadership this was 2005, so flashback a little bit. 2005, there wasn't leadership at the state or at the federal level on climate change, but cities were being impacted already by climate change and where change could really positively happen. So reflect back 12 years later, we're kind of same place, but or very similar place, that we know cities and local communities are where we can really have tremendous impact on reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, but preparing and being and more resilient for the climate change. As Caroline had said, government can't do it all. You're absolutely right. So that's why we partnered and went with Macalester College and with our neighborhood groups. Some of the strengths of St. Paul is the foundation of our neighborhood groups. We have all kinds of activities that are happening with volunteers doing everything from stenciling storm drains and cleaning out stuff out of the storm drain when the rain comes to doing volunteer plantings, everything. I mean, as I said, that is the foundation and the strength of St. Paul. I think what we, for the city piece, we know we have a role too. The city recommitted to its commitment on climate change in 2015 on the eve of the Paris COP21 Accord. So we signed what was called a Compact of Mayors. We also had a resolution adopted by the City Council that pledged that the city would do a number of steps, and we would work in concert with now I think it's close to 600 cities worldwide. And the idea was that at local levels, at community levels, or they called it sub-regional levels, or that we could get things done and reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and prepare for the coming climate change, regardless of what's going on at the national level. And so we pledged to do a greenhouse gas inventory, to do a vulnerability assessment, and to look at setting targets and goals, and then develop a climate action and resiliency plan. So we've been doing that work. We've made big progress with our partners since 2005. We had reduced our overall emissions by 27% in this community, which is ginormous, but I gotta tell you the truth. Large part was we had a coal-burning power plant from Xcel that converted to natural gas. It's still on fossil fuels, but that was a dramatic reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. We have a district energy system that's very common in Europe. They are transitioning off of fossil fuels to wood waste. So that was the primary, but we did have about an 8% reduction in consumption. So now we've been doing a new inventory and going to be setting our goals. Unfortunately, a lot of our emissions comes from transportation, and then from large buildings. The transportation sector is about 37% of our emissions in St. Paul, and the building sector is 52%, with commercial buildings being about 35%. So we have really appreciated the partnership with entities like our colleges here in St. Paul, like Macalester and St. Thomas, who are doing a lot of work to reduce their emissions in their facilities, but also doing things like the zero waste emissions. Our goal will be to be carbon neutral by 2050. That's our target. So we know we could be a little bit more aggressive. That's about, the state's goal is carbon neutral 80% by 2050. But we're looking at that, and I'd love to hear the feedback on that. We were really, I need to wrap it up, but we had a big milestone today. We passed a zoning plan for the Ford site. Who's not here for St. Paul? Okay, well, a little bit over to the south of us is a 140-acre site that was the Ford Motor site. The mayor's vision is to have that a net zero community. That when we build it out to, yes, which I think is big and bold. And it deserves a round of applause. And we've been doing a lot of planning about that, which means, really high-quality buildings that we want to be a net zero. We want to have a low-temperature district energy system. We want transit and bicycling. We're going to have a huge 9-acre stormwater infiltration that will, treat all the water on site before it discharges into the Mississippi River. And so we passed through the Planning Commission today, and now it goes on to the City Council later this year, which was a huge milestone and a very big vision for our community. So again, I really want to thank you on behalf of Mayor Coleman for your leadership on these issues and for being here. I really want to thank Michael and Leslie for your continued work in our communities and for helping bring this important conference and conversation to St. Paul. So again, thank you very much and enjoy your time here.
Okay, that was news to me, exciting news too. So in 2010, our guest speaker, Richard Heinberg, came to the Twin Cities to speak, and I was in the same place that you are today, in the audience. I was not really sure what I would hear, and I didn't actually know anything about Richard Heinberg. At the time, I thought I did know about climate change, but as my husband and I sat in the audience and heard the facts, our hearts sank. And I turned to my husband and said, how did I not know this? So I had an intellectual idea, but until I heard him talk about it, it hadn't really sunk in what that meant. And then Richard started to talk about transition towns and how we could get together with others in our community to take practical action to reduce our carbon footprint, and how hundreds of thousands of people in communities all over the world were already taking action. And I turned to my husband and said, we have got to change right now. And we did. We started Transition Longfellow with 4 people at a coffee shop and then 10 people in a living room. And now we have a Facebook group of almost 700 and a rotating cast of community members that help us to deliver 3 to 5 activities every month. We build raised bed gardens, little free libraries, solar cookers. We hosted an energy fair. We do day-long Skillshare activities. Right now, we're hosting a 6-part series on climate adaptation called When Climate Change Comes Home. And you can find information about that at the back table. We also made changes to our house. We finally finished that insulating. We invested in solar. And we made changes to our lifestyle. We got rid of a second car, we got roommates, we shifted our buying behavior. So we took one step and then another step, and the steps kept getting bigger, and we shared them broadly across the community. We also built an ever-expanding community. That has been the best part, from knowing maybe a dozen of my neighbors to probably 300 of my neighbors now. So transition is a great place for people to get together in community and get to know one another really well. I'm happy to know that my community now includes all of you. I am happy to also be able to finally tell Richard about the impact that he made. So he tossed a pebble into the sky blue waters here in Minneapolis, and his words just kept rippling outward. So I'd like to introduce you to our guest speaker for the evening, Richard Heinberg. He's a senior fellow at the Post-Carbon Institute. Richard is a journalist. He has written extensively on energy, resource depletion, economics, and climate. He's author of 13 books, including The End of Growth, Adapting to Our New Economic Reality, and Power Down, Options and Actions for a Post-Carbon World. So let's welcome Richard.
No, that's not right. All right. We're in business. Okay, well. It's great to be here. And I'm proud to say I was at that gathering in 2005 in Kinsale, Ireland, where Rob Hopkins started Transition Towns. And, hello? Now we have sound as well. And then in 2007, the first international transition meeting in Britain. I was at that as well. And I have to say, there are more people here tonight than there were at that gathering. So that tells you something about how things are going with transition. When I met Rob Hopkins in Ireland in 2005, I knew immediately that this was a brilliant young guy who was going to accomplish something. He was amazingly talented. He was teaching permaculture at the time and had this great intuitive sense of just, what works and how to communicate with people and how to bring people together. Rob is very upbeat, much more so than I am. And fortunately, he's going to be talking to you tomorrow morning, but you're stuck with me tonight. So I'm going to start on a really cheery note. Maybe some of you have seen this article in the current New York Magazine. It's gotten more reads than any previous article in New York Magazine. So a lot of people are talking about it. It's basically a look at the worst case scenario if our current climate models turn out to be right and we keep pumping greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. How bad could it get? Well, according to the author David Wallace Wells, pretty horrible indeed. So are we doomed? Well, I'll give you a little bit of good news to start with, which is that according to our calculations at Post-Carbon Institute, and not just ours, but a number of other folks as well, some of the worst of the emissions scenarios are probably unrealistic. I don't know if you can see in the back there, these are reserves of coal, oil, and natural gas expressed in terms of carbon content. On the far left is BP. The BP oil company puts out an annual review of world energy. So these are reserves figures from BP. And then the representative concentration pathways from the IPCC, in other words, they're scenarios for carbon emissions going forward. And as you can see, some of the IPCC emissions pathway scenarios actually include a lot more carbon than the BP reserves. When those get translated into this kind of chart, you see that the BP reserves are really only consistent with the RCP 2.6 or 4.5 scenarios. The high emissions scenario, RCP 8.5, the one at the very top there, is generally called the business as usual scenario. So that's assuming that we continue burning fossil fuels at ever increasing rates until the end of the century. So our calculation is that that's probably unrealistic. That still gets us to about 550 parts per million. We're about 410 right now. We don't want to see 550 parts per million. And where we are right now is scary enough. We're beginning to see feedbacks in terms of melting of permafrost, tundra in the Arctic, and also oceanic hydrates. This is methane that's locked in ice formations. Methane is a more powerful greenhouse gas than CO2. It's shorter lived in the atmosphere, but if a lot of it gets released all at once, that could be a short-term but very powerful burst of warming for planet Earth. Also, it's important to remember this is not all about climate change. We've got some other environmental problems going on, like we're running through about 25 billion tons of topsoil annually. We're overusing the world's fresh water. Species of animals and plants are going extinct at about 1,000 times the background rate. So this is a systemic problem. It's not just climate change. We have created a world system that is inherently unsustainable. And so the only really meaningful response is going to be a systemic response. Yes, reducing CO2 emissions is really important, but if we're going to deal with the entire systemic problem, we have to reduce population, reduce per capita consumption, redesign industrial processes, and redistribute wealth. That's an enormous task when you think about it. Now, policymakers globally are hoping for a technological fix. If we just break down this systemic problem into a bunch of different symptoms and then attack each of the symptoms with some kind of technological fix, like, well, we're running out of fresh water, so we'll just do a bunch of desalination plants. Or we have climate change, so we'll attack that with geoengineering. And you get the idea, on and on. That's basically the approach that's being attempted worldwide. But is it realistic to approach a systemic problem with symptomatic solutions? What happens when we do that in medicine, for example, if you have a systemic illness and you only treat the symptoms? Doesn't really work all that well. So what's actually required is a culture change. We need to adjust to nature's long-term limits. We've overshot Earth's carrying capacity for the number of human beings and for the amount of per capita consumption of Earth's resources. We were able to do that over a short term because we had a lot of cheap energy to work with. Using fossil fuels, we were able to stretch natural limits that had kept human beings in place over countless millennia. We were able to stretch those limits increase our numbers and our carrying capacity over a short period of time. But now those limits are starting to snap back in various ways, not just in terms of climate change, but in terms of resource depletion, loss of biodiversity, and all the rest. Now, do we have to all consume like North Americans in order to be happy? Well, no. In fact, North Americans aren't among the happier people in the world. If you start, nosing around different countries and doing surveys, you very quickly realize that there are people in countries that use a small fraction of the energy and materials that North Americans do, who are happier than we are. But we don't have an economic system that aims for happiness. The managers of our economy do not have gross national happiness as the measure of success. They have GDP, which is basically throughput of money and materials and energy. So we need a different economic system, a different set of indicators to start with, but really a whole different system and a different culture to manage that system. Okay, what's this slide? Wait a minute, how did this get in here? Well, there's a problem here. See, for a number of years, I gave hundreds of presentations all over the world on the subject called peak oil, which nobody talks about anymore, but every once in a while, somebody stops me on the street and says, well, what's up with that now? So, I guess I have to tell you. Some of our forecasts were over-enthusiastic. We were saying that peak oil was going to be a big problem, and that it was back in 2005, for example, when a transition started, we were talking about real global economic problems emerging maybe by 2010. Something like that. One of the petroleum geologists that I listened to a lot in those days and still regard very highly was a French petroleum geologist named Jean Laherrère. And in my first book on this subject, published back in 2003, called The Party's Over, I pretty much endorsed Jean's forecast for a global peak in conventional oil around 2010 and unconventional oil around 2015. Well, back in 2005, 2015 seemed like a long time in the future, so we didn't really pay much attention to that, and so most of us were anticipating impacts coming sooner. So we got some things wrong. There was really too much emphasis, I think, on trying to forecast a specific date for the global peak in oil production. And I think we did a poor job of understanding energy economics. We assumed that as oil became more scarce, the price would just go up and up and up. And for a few years it did. Remember back in 2008 when the price of oil hit $150 a barrel and the economy crashed. Well, that seemed like a vindication of our whole scenario. But what happened then? The Federal Reserve and other central banks stepped in with quantitative easing, lowering interest rates, effectively pumping trillions of dollars into the world's financial systems. And one of the results of that was an enormous amount of money ended up in the world's energy companies, particularly smaller oil companies here in the US that adapted some technology that was already hanging around, namely hydrofracturing and horizontal drilling, to production of what's called in the business light, tight oil. oil that's locked up in geological formations where, the oil is there, but it just doesn't want to flow very much. So if you can crack open the rock using hydrofracturing, you can get more of that stuff out. And that's what's happened over the last few years. With cheap credit and lots of investment capital, a lot of this stuff has been produced, and U.S. oil production has soared as a result. So we didn't anticipate Federal Reserve policy. Another thing we did was that we assumed a symmetrical production curve. What goes up must come down, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. And I think what we're actually seeing is that production curve is getting pushed forward so that when the downside comes, it's likely to be steeper. And when is that going to come? I'm not going to try and make any forecasts. But the U.S. tight oil industry is being held together by cheap credit and easy money. And whenever that ends, whether it's this year or next year, 5 years from now, we're going to see a bloodbath in the tight oil industry. The oil industry has changed, in any case, in profound ways over the last few years, ways that can't be explained outside of the narrative that we've been talking about for all of these years. Back in 1990, global reserves of oil were regular conventional oil like the U.S. used to produce back when we were the world's foremost oil producer, same kind of oil Saudi Arabia still produces today. But those kinds of reserves have been depleted. So today, stated oil reserves are larger than they were in 1990, but they can consist of kinds of oil that are a lot more expensive to produce. The Canadian tar sands, light tight oil in the US, extra heavy oil in Venezuela, and so on. And so the oil industry, unable to maintain the high prices that we saw in 2011, 2013, is now in deep trouble. Most of the oil companies are losing money, and especially in the tight oil industry, we're seeing losses for almost every barrel of oil produced. So this is an industry that's running on fumes. Why is that important? Well, from a climate standpoint, I guess you could say that's good news. But from a societal standpoint, we depend on energy for everything we do, and oil is still our foremost energy source. And as it's taking more and more money to produce these lower grades of oil, alternative or unconventional oils, it's also taking more energy. And since energy is the point of the whole exercise, that has real systemic impacts. Oil production just 2 or 3 decades ago got an energy return of something like 50 to 1. For every unit of energy invested in exploring for oil, producing oil, 50 units of energy were produced. Now that ratio, especially in the US, is down to more like 10 to 1. Well, that still sounds pretty good. If you could invest $1 and get $10 back, that's great. But in the energy world, we need higher returns than that. To operate a modern industrial society, we need an energy return ratio of better than 10 to 1. So that societal EROEI ratio is declining. And because it's something that most people don't talk about, or aren't even aware of, economists don't talk about it, we don't really understand its systemic impacts. And its major systemic impact is slowing economic growth. We had very rapid economic growth during the 20th century, especially after World War II, when we had the highest returns on our investments of energy and energy production. Energy was cheap and abundant and seemed limitless. And so the economy expanded year after year, 3, 4, even 5% per year here in this country. It's not happening anymore. We've reached the end of that era. Well, why not just substitute other energy sources for oil? Well, yes, that's a good idea, but substitution is a slow process. It's going to take time. And talking about oil, well, yes, electric cars are on the market, but 99% of the cars on the road right now are still gasoline-burning and internal combustion engines. Nearly all of our trucking is fueled by oil distillates, all commercial shipping and aviation. Most U.S. rail, that's different in other parts of the country, much more electric rail elsewhere, but here in this country we're stuck mostly with diesel rail. There's a lot of talk about peak oil demand. And yes, certainly as we transition away from reliance on oil for transportation, we will see peak oil demand. But is that going to happen before we encounter supply disruptions? I think the jury's out on that. Frankly, I would bet on the supply disruptions happening first. So we peak oilers were warning that since energy is at the core of the economy and our energy system is being impacted by depletion and falling energy returns on energy investment, then we can therefore anticipate more economic and financial instability, more social and political instability, possibly even oil wars. I think we failed in many ways because our effort was to warn society ahead of time. That was the whole point of the exercise. It wasn't to score points by getting an exactly accurate forecast of when global oil production was going to peak. You know, was it going to be 2010 or 2011 or 2012? All of that was beside the point. The whole point really was to get society to make some fundamental changes, and that had to happen ahead of time. There was a report issued in 2005 called the Hirsch Report. It was commissioned by the U.S. Department of Energy, looking at the possibility of global oil supply issues and what would have to be done to respond to those supply issues. And the upshot of the report was, unless you can do something 10 years ahead of those supply issues happening, there's almost no point, because you're going to be, the whole society is going to be deeply impacted. Well, I think we gave society a 10-year heads up, but nothing happened. So in essence, we pretty much failed. I don't think we were wrong in our essential message. We did get some aspects of it wrong. We got energy economics kind of wrong and a few other things. But we didn't do what we had set out to do, which was to warn society and make some fundamental changes. Okay, now back to our regularly scheduled programming. And damn, this little... Yes. We've got the touch now. So, fortunately, we're not seeing any political or social issues or... things have changed, haven't they? We are living in a different era than we were prior to, let's say, 2005 or 2008. The ground is shaking underneath us. This recent election was certainly an earthquake in the political world, and it's entirely understandable from a certain perspective how and why things went the way they did. A lot of folks were and are fed up with the direction things had been going in. The loss of good manufacturing jobs as a result of globalization, the sort of neoconservative lock on foreign policy in the US that led to the Iraq War and Afghanistan War, et cetera, But what we have as a result of that election is a government that's in denial. That's in denial certainly about climate change, but a lot of other things as well. And this is not about partisan politics. I may hit this note again a couple of times tonight. My argument is that what we're seeing in Washington right now is not normal party politics. What we're seeing right now is something off the scale. And I think what just happened today? We saw the firing of the chief of staff, Trump's chief of staff. There's war going on even within the executive branch, within the administration itself, and then the executive branch is increasingly at war with the rest of government. This is a problem, really, that extends to the very core of what the federal government is all about. There's a wonderful article, it's a very disturbing article, headline article in Vanity Fair right now about the US Department of Energy and the Trump transition team coming into the US Department of Energy and how that was different from previous transitions going to the Bush administration, to the Obama administration. They were used to, a couple of hundred people showing up and having security clearances and getting, hours and days of briefing. How do you run this thing? Because this is a really complicated machine, this federal government. Even the U.S. Department of Energy, just one department that's in charge of all of our nuclear facilities and nuclear weapons and nuclear waste. That's really important stuff. You want qualified, competent people in charge of that. So the Trump people show up, and it's like they don't even show up on the first day. After a few days, like a half dozen political appointees show up, and they're not interested in learning anything about how this machine works. All they want to do is find out, okay, who's in charge of climate change around here so we can fire them. It's all, So the managerial functions of the federal government are being hollowed out. And this will have consequences in the real world. Again, this is not just party politics. What we're seeing is not normal. And I'm not going to make forecasts as to when or how or what's going to happen, but I think we're going to see some crazy things as a result. If you think things are crazy now, hang on to your hat. Even just later this year, I suspect we're going to see some stuff going down that is going to make your hair curl. So with all of this happening, with climate change happening, with our energy system starting to crumble as a result of depletion of the fuels that we're currently relying on, with our political system being hollowed out, and our economic system running on the kind of cheap credit that can't go on forever, what should we be doing? Well, those of us who are the adults in the room, who understand at least some of this that's happening, I think need to take responsibility for seeing if we can calm things down to the extent that we can and make sure the worst doesn't happen. We need civility and cooperation. The worst thing that can happen right now is for everyone to be at everyone else's throats. And we've seen a lot of that in the last election and since then. But that's extremely counterproductive. So we have to get away from that kind of interaction as much as we can. We need to build resilience in our society. Resilience is important, especially if you can anticipate shocks are coming. And shocks are coming, as we've seen. So where do we build resilience? It would be nice if we could build resilience at the global scale, at the national scale. And there are some folks who are seriously trying to do that. I wish them all the luck in the world, but the reality is that most of us don't have levers that we can pull at the national or global scale. What's available to us is the opportunity to work in our communities. And I would argue that work in our communities, work at home with friends and family and neighbors, is ultimately just as effective as what could be done conceivably at the national and international level. Why? Because it's a lot easier to change course. If you have to shift the direction of the Titanic, it's slow going. Whereas if you're in a rowboat, it's a lot easier to change direction. And also, decisions are made a lot closer to where the impact is going to be felt. So it's fairer. It's a lot easier to have real democracy at the local level than at the national or global level, where there are so many entrenched interests at play. Already we are seeing at the local level a lot of resistance to what's happening in the executive branch right now. And I think we're going to be seeing a lot more of that as time goes on. And I think that's a good thing up to a point. As I mentioned earlier, having folks at each other's throats and talking past one another is not a good thing, but rightly, I think localities, states, cities, counties are seeing the agenda of the current administration as being highly corrosive to the things that they need and want to see happen, like the kinds of climate efforts we heard about earlier that are happening here in St. Paul. So all of that resistance work may be important, at least up to a point, but what's more important is building local alternatives. And those alternatives are most important where they're directed toward meeting people's basic needs in one way or another. Whether it's through local food or local power, the local economy, local nonprofit banks, otherwise known as credit unions, local worker-owned businesses. This is an infrastructure that can quietly come into being and has been for many years, started long before transition appeared on the scene, and is non-controversial. Everybody loves it because their friends and neighbors are doing it, and it's local, and actually meets people's needs. Most of the US economy is local. More people are employed in local businesses than are employed in giant corporations. So it's not as though this is something that's, a good idea, but, can't really accomplish very much. We are embedded in a network of local economies and local economic activity that is often invisible just because it doesn't take up as much space in terms of advertising and public attention. We hear about things like Google and Facebook and even Tesla and so on because these are big national companies. But that may not be where the most exciting things are actually happening. This is an interesting slide that I took from a presentation I was doing back in my own local Sonoma County, California. So that's just some stuff that's happening in Sonoma County, but wherever you're from, I'm sure you can create a slide that is much better than this one, And I think that's a great thing to do when you're giving presentations in your town or city or county, as I'm sure you do all the time, helping people understand what good things are already happening. It's really reassuring to folks to know that we're not trying to invent something that doesn't already exist. We're just trying to help something happen that most of us may already be involved with and not even realize. Given the new administration's attitude toward climate change, it's also reassuring to know that there's an enormous amount of climate and energy work that is going on locally and that's not going to be impacted by this change of administration. That's certainly true in California. Our Governor Jerry Brown has stepped up the state guidelines and targets and so on. But it's true all across the country, and not just at state levels, but in cities and so on. Now, you can ask, as I think almost everyone does from time to time, is it enough? And I think what's the implicit question there really is it enough to forestall shocks and keep us living more or less as we are now? And frankly, no, I don't think it is. I don't think anything would be enough at this point in history to keep us living the way we're living now, because the way we're living now is fundamentally unsustainable. And when I say it's unsustainable, I don't mean it's not sufficiently eco-groovy. The word sustainable means you can keep doing it indefinitely. And the whole reason we have a sustainability movement is that smart people look at our system and they say, you can't keep doing that very long. That's the reality. So the real question we should be asking ourselves is it enough to reduce the number and severity of casualties that we're likely to see in the process of change as this system begins to break down? And is it enough to begin to lay the groundwork for recovery and for the building of a sustainable culture worthy of survival? I think that's a useful goal, Are we really concerned that our grandchildren have access to Instagram and Facebook? Is that the height of human cultural achievement? Or is there, can you imagine a human culture that would be worth defending with your life? That would be worth passing on to your grandchildren and feeling proud of? That's what we should be aiming for. We know that, and all sorts of social research has borne this out, that during times of real crisis, war and natural disasters, people come together. You know, go back and look at stories of World War II, the Great Depression, et cetera, and it's amazing what people can do in terms of self-sacrifice for one another's sake. And I'm sure that as you know, business as usual starts to become a distant memory, we will see a lot of folks step up to the plate and do things that maybe, you know, we couldn't even imagine ourselves doing today. Great. But with prolonged bad times, hard times, it's also often the case that people start looking for scapegoats. And I think it's no accident that, you know, World War II happened after the Great Depression. You know, folks look for someone to blame when their needs aren't getting met consistently over a long period of time. That's I think part of what led us to the election of 2016. So it's really important that we avoid the blame game, that we help our friends and neighbors avoid the blame game, that we help everyone around us understand that what we're going through is not just the fault of this group or this political party or whatever. This is a more or less inevitable transition that society is going through, and it's going to have its hard times, and it's going to have its times of celebration. If we are successful in seeding the beginnings of a new regenerative culture worthy of survival, then I think, you know, we are going to have a lot to celebrate, not just at the end of the day, but along the way as well. In order to get there, we're going to have to bring our friends and neighbors along, whether it's, you know, getting beyond the red-blue divides and conversations, and just getting beyond having to talk about what's going on in Washington all the time. You know, I'm sorry for bringing it up tonight, but what's really important is what we're doing together, what we're accomplishing together. My own organization, Post-Carbon Institute, we're trying to support this work every way we can. We've published a series of books, the Community Resilience Readers, that can be helpful in building local food, local energy, and local financial systems. Later this fall, we'll be publishing the Community Resilience Reader. Maybe some of you are familiar with our Post-Carbon Reader. It's used in classrooms all across the country in sustainability courses. And this is intended for the same audience. It's a whole raft of expert writers contributing to an understanding of our 21st century sustainability challenge, but then what can we do about that in terms of building community resilience? So that's something to look forward to. Also, we've produced a 22-part video series. It's a little over 4 hours of video altogether. That's also aimed at an educational audience, but it's great for showing in, say, libraries or, you know, in study groups. It goes through the sustainability challenges of the 21st century, and again, all the way through to how to do a community resilience assessment, which is something that you might consider undertaking in your community. So I just conclude by saying, you know, in my view, there is no more important work on the planet than what each and every one of you is setting out to do. And there's no more important thing going on in the United States right now than what's going on in this room right now. We are the folks who've shown up. You know, we may not be, and myself included, we may not be the most experienced or the most educated or whatever, but we're the ones who got it and showed up. So it's our responsibility to do what we can. Our national leaders aren't doing it, and they're not gonna do it. We have a vision of what's possible, thanks to partly to Rob Hopkins and partly to, you know, whatever experience we individually have already had in community organizing or whatever our background is. And this is an opportunity to learn from one another and take some of that home and redouble our efforts. Heaven knows we have plenty to do. So I salute you for being here. Thank you. Thanks very much. I'm not leaving the stage because we're going to have questions. So, and I think we have a microphone, a roving mic, two mic runners. So
we have Pat over here and Mark over here. We'll go side to side.
Hello. Hi, Richard. Thanks for coming in 2010 to South High School. We had a number of the transition towns in the Twin Cities got launched at that time. And the good news is that we have a very strong Metropolitan Council that requires cities to do a 20-year plan. And those are due in 2018. So all of you who are either in Minneapolis, St. Paul, or a suburb, you can influence that 20-year plan right now. Most of the consultants helping the cities write these plans do not know anything about resilience. And so I'm wondering, we do have a resilience section on the Met Council's website that talks generally about adaptation and mitigation, but not really much about relocalizing the economy. Do you have thoughts about like what would be key policies you would want people, cities to adopt in order to use whatever time we have left between now and whatever oil scarcity?
yeah, well, I think what you all need is a resilience assessment and resilience action plan. And so that's going, folks who do that are going to come to different conclusions depending on where they are, because part of the resilience assessment is looking at your particular community. What are the likely threats? What are the opportunities? What are the resources that are available? And those kinds of questions can only be answered on a local basis. So one thing I would suggest is, as soon as this book comes out, maybe find a way to provide copies of it to the key people who are doing that 20-year plan.
Yeah, hi, Richard. Yeah, we've been going great guns sideways, backwards, on Whidbey Island. But we've hit this thing that we have a naval air station on the north end of the island, and Trump, even in the Obama era, more money is being poured in. It's a sort of a Boeing to the Navy. Our whole economy, our senators, our representatives, nobody in our region will touch the Navy. And so they're actually starting to poison the water and fly over the quietest place on the, North American continent. So we're just like, it just strikes me. I would love to hear your reflections on, as we build from the bottom up, our joyous, interconnected, happy movement. But we're doing it in a context where the giants are falling and they're grabbing for everything.
Right.
And so what do you suggest? Do you have any cool strategies? Do you have any stories from the field? What do we do in relationship to these giants who have the capacity to crash what we're doing, no matter how strong we get?
Yeah, that's a tough question. Sometimes resistance is called for. Sometimes it's a matter of just getting out of the giant's way and making sure it doesn't fall on you. I know those aren't very satisfying answers necessarily. It would be a lot more satisfying to have, a cool technique that you can plug in no matter what your situation. But I don't know what that would be, quite frankly. It's very location specific.
Hi, Richard. Thank you very much indeed for an incredibly inspiring talk and energizing the room. I noted in your talk that you very much measure things. You're very much a measurer. You're looking at things. What would you recommend for the transition organizations in terms of what we should be trying to measure in terms of our impact and our effectiveness, so that we can really get that across to people who really think that we're sort of a group of, well-meaning tree huggers, and we're really not, to help energize and to help people take us, to the next level?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and that relates to funding also, because if you're hoping to acquire funding for projects, the folks who are going to give you money always want to have some kind of metrics. And how many people are impacted in one way or another, how much in terms of carbon emissions is saved or averted. Those are two really obvious metrics. And then the amount of carbon saving per dollar investment, I think, is really important, because there are different ways of saving carbon emissions. Some of them are really expensive, whereas behavior change is really cheap. So if you can inspire people to change behavior, then you actually get some measurable impact for very little investment, and that looks really good to funders.
Yeah, hi, Richard. You mentioned this, and other people have as well, about saying these things are not partisan issues and to not see them in that light. I have a hard time with that. I'm not seeing any friends on the right side of the aisle. They, and even the people who have tried on a national level have failed, who've been on that side of the aisle and tried. Right. In our own state, it's been a long time since we've had a Republican governor on the level of Arne Carlson, who was interested in environmental issues. It's been a long time since he's been in office. The people who are currently there aren't there. My point is that, my question is, are we spending, in trying to be the good guys, in trying to reach across the aisle, are we wasting our time? Should we just be working on consolidating, first of all, with people who are like us? Mm-hmm. In the room today, I'm sure that many of us probably are thinking we'd like that average age to be a little bit lower, and trying to get more younger people involved, and reaching for people who are like-minded, maybe younger. Well, I just want your comments on that, and maybe you could explain that, because I'm not understanding what we're going to get out of trying to reach out further rather than consolidate on our own side.
Right. Yeah, that's a really good question, and frankly, I think probably 90% of the activity of any given transition group is understandably going to go toward consolidating within the tribe, basically, people who are like-minded, and enlarging that tribe as much as possible. But you are within a community with that includes other folks who don't understand you. And the more you can manage that relationship in such a way that it's a non-confrontational relationship, the better off you're going to be over the long run, because you can avoid some unnecessary interaction with people. Why have enemies if you can have at least a respectful relationship?
Thank you, Richard. My name is Callan. I'm from Port Townsend, Washington. There was a few things that you said towards the end of your presentation that I'm hoping you could elaborate on more, and this ties in directly to what you were just saying about diversity. I don't think it's a coincidence that this is a very homogenous room. We all pretty much look alike, and that's not a coincidence. So to say that we are the folks who showed up, I think is a little bit misleading. This conference wasn't possibly available to everyone. Being a young person, someone had to sponsor me to be here. I don't know if that was available to anyone else across the nation. I'm sure there could have been some opportunity, but that's how I'm here today. So there are other people out there that are not white, that are not older, that want to be here too. So we are not the only ones who are showing up. On that note, I would like to hear what you have to say more about the culture worthy of survival. What does that mean? Because I know personally my culture is not the only culture. So what is the culture worthy of survival?
Yeah, well, I think most human societies over, I don't want to get too much into anthropology here, but what we have currently, the commercial industrial civilization is a tremendous anomaly in human history for many, many ways, not only because of its reliance on fossil fuels and extractive industries and all the rest, but because of its extreme individualism. We humans are inherently communal, tribal animals. We're not happy unless we are, cooperating with people around us. And our current commercial culture thwarts and frustrates that in so many ways. And as a result of that, we have widespread depression and malaise. A healthy culture is one in which you just don't see that much depression, and cross-cultural surveys, underscore that's the case. A healthy culture is a beautiful culture that prizes handcraft and creativity, and democratizes it so that everybody is an artist in one way or another. And by professionalizing the arts, we have raised, performance levels, if you wish, to astronomical heights, just as with sports and so on. But we've also taken it out of the hands of, out of the reach of most people. And so we end up with very narrow lives, very limited opportunities for creativity, and very limited opportunities for making culture together. A healthy culture is kind of a handmade culture. It's a culture you make together with the people around you. And once we have the opportunity to do that, I think it will be a culture worthy of survival. What we have right now, I think, is something that is not only inherently unsustainable, but also just not worth preserving in a lot of ways, because it makes us miserable. I hope that answers your question a little bit.
More and more ordinary people are beginning to get it and want to make the changes. How about the big corporations? Are you able to speak to any of the leaders in the big corporations see if they will understand and get it and make the changes?
Yeah, I haven't gotten any invitations lately. If and when I do, I'm happy to show up. I mean, I've talked at a couple of corporate headquarters. I know a couple of billionaires, but these people generally are not so interested.
Hi, thank you. First, thanks for making a distinction between our elected officials and their behavior and the neighbors who voted. Sorry, better? Yeah, so the first was a thanks for making the distinction between the kind of craziness from our elected officials that we see versus the more rural conservative neighbors that we have that have just had to deal with things that don't make sense.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a really important distinction to call out. Yesterday so I have a question and then an offer after that. So yesterday I was at a group called Better Angels, working to create red-blue conversations. And the facilitator has 2 versions of their examples and works well in either space. So I'm wondering if you have or are considering having a version of this talk intended for conservative spaces.
That's a great idea. I'll see if I can follow up on that. Thank you.
Right, and then the offer is a bit of optimism. So a couple of days ago, the 25th pair of representatives, one from each side of the aisle, you can only join if you join with a partner, joined the Climate Solutions Caucus. And it's a caucus in the House of Representatives created by Carlos Cabela and Ted Deutsch from South Florida, where the ocean water bubbles up on the streets at high tide. That's bad, by the way. So Citizens Climate Lobby, they ask us to do this odd thing, to show up with every representative with respect and appreciation. It seems to be working. So I think all politics are local, just like transitions. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you for your emphasis on local and on community building. Although I presume that you do not advocate giving up on national politics. Politics in this country swings. The pendulum's going to come back. Congressional elections are not much more than a year off. We're going to make a change there too, I hope. The model that I work with is very local and very community-oriented, co-housing. We have a booth over here. I urge people to check it out. 30 households sharing lots more than most Americans do. You also emphasized or mentioned population. Thank you for that. It seems to me that that's a huge driver. And that kind of brings me to my question, which is a lot of things in this country and the world are predicated on growth. The economy, so on. Are you aware of models that are sustainable without growth, that are, that work?
Yeah. Well, the growth economy is not the norm in human history. It's an anomaly that we've seen basically just in the last century or so in industrial civilization as a result of cheap fossil fuels. So the normal human economy is not one that's continually growing. So we don't have to invent something that's never existed for. We just have to get back to normal, first of all. Then there's a whole branch of economics called ecological economics that deals with what's called a steady state economy and what needs to change in order for a steady state economy to happen, and how it can function and so on. So reading the works of Herman Daly and his followers, I think, is really helpful for that. And then, especially in Europe, not so much in the US, there's a whole degrowth movement which says, well, not only do we need a steady state economy, but actually our current economic throughput is too big to be sustainable. So we need to actually reduce the size of the economy until it fits with the long-term productivity of planet Earth. And there's an organization called the Global Footprint Network that keeps track of this. And currently we're using about 1.5 Earths worth of annual productivity. So we need to reduce our consumption by at least that much. And of course, in North America, we're talking about, if everybody lived the way we do, we would need 4 Earths to supply everything. Well, how can we use more than 1 Earth's worth of resources? By drawing down future carrying capacity for future generations. That's what we're doing right now. So the degrowth movement, the steady state economy, and ecological economics are tremendously valuable resources for beginning to think differently about economic growth.
Do you know of sustainable economy ratio, what that is, the components of it, equal blah, 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 and what countries have come close to that in the last 10 years?
Oh, like from the standpoint of the global footprint or the national footprint? And
I think so. I know the World Wildlife Fund helped with a number of other organizations created. It's like, consumption, education divided by blah, blah, blah.
Right.
And there was, I know one country that came to qualify as a sustainable economy.
Well, when you look at a country like, I don't know if it was Costa Rica, but if you look at a country like Costa Rica, Cuba is also doing very well. Denmark is doing very well in terms of, well, there are several ways of measuring how well a nation is doing in this regard. What's their carbon emissions? How happy are the people in that country? What's their economic throughput, their resource footprint? And if you measure all of those things, there are several countries that are doing extremely well. Have very low carbon emissions, very low economic throughput, and yet have very happy people. So what we should be doing is studying the heck out of those countries and saying, how can we get more of that? How can we do more of that?
So as a truck driver's daughter, when 6 kids in the family, we were able to afford 2 vacations every year, and we had a 4-bedroom house. So something's really shifted economically, and when people were hearing "Make America Great Again," I think that's what they were feeling.
Right.
And so I think really opening up that, because even I read something like Trump voters have a lower lifespan than Hillary Clinton voters. So all of this stuff gets really complex. In our culture right now, we have a lot of images of zombies, a lot of skulls, and I think that's all rising from someplace. And what it seems to me like the big leverage point here is how we create our own economy. Shopping at co-ops, the maker movement. And that's what this transition town. So do you have good models of people making their own jobs and switching their economy over locally so that it's more sane, so that it doesn't compete with the insane, dominant paradigm?
I suspect that there are lots of those stories in this room. I'm a guy who sits in front of his computer all day and does analysis and writing and occasionally public speaking. So I'm not the best person to tell you about stuff like that. The people who are sitting around you are the best ones for that, and that's why I'm in awe of what you all are doing.
Hey, Richard. Thank you so much for being here. It's an honor, and to everybody else who is here, it's really awesome to be gathered. Respect to the brother over here who mentioned, the young brother who was talking about some of the acknowledging some of the problematic aspects of this movement. If there's actually one thing that really excites me most in this movement is the possibility of really recognizing some of the intersectionality between these related issues of climate justice, but then also racial and socioeconomic justice and sexual and gender equality and peace and anti-imperialism and all of these things. So my sort of first of 2 questions that are related is, how do you feel about more overtly acknowledging this link, and more overtly kind of acknowledging this bridge between the climate and all of these other related issues. And hopefully this isn't too much of a doozy, but there is kind of like a part two. And for so long I felt so disempowered on a national and global political scale. I just felt like it was just all this truth about what's going on with our climate, and inequality was not actionable. And then it was through transition and the local empowerment that's where I found, oh, I can do something. I can take a bite out of this. It's actionable. And that's where I grooved for the last 10 years. I was grooving on that until recently, until this last year, really, I started feeling this little taste of possible national political empowerment again. And it was for a brief moment, or shall I say a primary season. And and I know I'm not alone in that, so by that sound I just heard. So I mean, there was a brother up front who was talking about, what do we do when the folks on the on the right side of the aisle aren't helping us out? But what about the fact that the folks on the left side of the aisle aren't necessarily helping us out? Thank you. So if I could kind of somehow bring it all together. And even with the Congressional Climate Solutions Caucus, which I honor and it's awesome, even some of the Democratic and Republican members of that take money from big oil and big pharma and weapons manufacturers, and it's ludicrous. So my question, what say you about the Democrats in this age of division? What say you about Bernie? What say you about, if we elect a real revolution of values, can we turn it around? How can we actually vote the people's victory? Or can we at all?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. You want to give the rest of the talk? Yeah. Well, not that it matters, but I was a Bernie supporter too, and am. And I think it's important to support one another in terms of our various issues. And sometimes it comes down to a particular issue. And that's when, it's important for that issue to come to the fore. And it's not so important for everybody to insist that their issue is being discussed at the same time. When we do that, when we insist on having every issue at the center all the time, sometimes that's a recipe for doing nothing. Sometimes it really has to come to focus in carbon emissions, or in economic inequality, or in gender or race, and that's the subject at focus for that moment. And it's helpful if we can support each other in those moments without requiring that the whole thing be in focus all the time. That's just my thought on that. Anything else?
This may be dividing it up. I don't know. I'm responding to the word resources and wanting to ask you about words and word choices and how we can use words to make the fundamental internal psychological shift that I think we need to. One of the last times I was in this room was with Vandana Shiva. And I want to give a brief definition of ecofeminism, which is that the dominant cultures have treated the earth, animals, women, children, people of color, poor people as resources. And we're not. Nothing is a resource. Everything is part of the community. But it's really easy for us to use the word resource, and I think when we do, we think it means something we get to exert control over. And it's easy to use the word community and think only of people. I'm a woods child. I think trees are my best friend, and we're a lot less lonely if we recognize that. But it's hard to switch our words. And I don't want you to have to revise the title or anything, but do you have ideas of other words that don't
carry that idea of stuff I get to control and use without recognition of its own holiness.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good point. And, you know, it's some of, I think it's particularly helpful in addressing different audiences to adapt vocabulary to the audience as well. On the rare occasions when I speak to people in the energy industry, I know that they speak in terms of oil production. How much oil are we using? How much oil are we producing? Well, we use oil, but when we burn it, it's gone forever. It's not like we use it and then it goes back. And we don't produce it in the sense that we make it out of something else. All we're doing is digging it out of the earth and burning it once and for all. So we're depleting it, right? And depletion is a word that folks in the resource industries don't like to hear and don't like to use. So they use the word production instead. So more care in vocabulary, constantly retranslating what we're saying for not just for different audiences, but for more truth-telling. I think that's really important. Thank you.
Richard, in reading your books, I believe one of the other indicators of what could happen has to do with debt and a financial crisis. You didn't really touch on that tonight. Can you just maybe give an update on that? Maybe read the tea leaves on that?
Yeah, well, you know, we had this little hiccup back in 2008 called the global financial crisis. And we solved that with, as I mentioned during the talk, you know, massive creation of financial stuff, you know, money. The Fed put trillions of dollars on its balance sheet, lowered interest rates to encourage more borrowing, and so guess what? We have increased our indebtedness, but we've done it in ways that are really problematic long term. Student debt, for example, very, very high levels of student debt. Very high levels of automotive, you know, people buying cars on credit, and a lot of that ain't going to be paid back. We have a financial system that really can only continue to work to the extent that everybody believes that it's going to continually grow. The stock market is all about expectation and belief. And as long as everyone believes that something's going to be worth more tomorrow than it is today, then it is. And as soon as that belief goes away, then suddenly it isn't. I suspect that we have one of those learning moments coming up soon. I mean, historically, we have market cycles about every 7 or 8 years. And so the last big downturn was 2008. We're kind of due for one now. My gut says that once Wall Street understands how really destructive and chaotic what's happening in Washington really is, then the bottom is going to fall out of this so-called Trump bump. But I don't know how long it can go on. Maybe, you know, maybe 6 weeks, maybe 6 years. I doubt if it's 6 years. I think it's probably a lot less than that. But, you know, we'll see. And it could be much worse this time than it was in 2008, because after all, in 2008, it was possible to lower interest rates and for the Fed to you know, increase its balance sheet by all those trillions of dollars. Could they do that again? You know, interest rates are so low right now, they don't have very far to go to get to zero. Then we get to negative interest rates, and who knows. But I think the central banks have used up most of their ammunition, and Janet Yellen, bless her heart, believes that the economy is doing just fine right now. I don't know how she comes to that conclusion, but I suspect that she's going to be disabused of that illusion before too long. Maybe that's it. Okay, last question. Yes, please.
Last question. I want to thank you, Richard, I want to thank you for the talk you've just given and for the evolving body of your work over time. And I want to thank you also for taking on some very hard questions as honestly as you could that don't really fall within your area of specialty necessarily. Questions about culture, questions about anthropology, questions about politics directly. But I want to add to your burden
Thank you
at the
so
same
much.
time. At the same time. And I also think it's a testament to this audience that the questions are coming up. And it's a question for you and the Post-Carbon Institute, and it's a question for the transition movement as well. From myself as a climate justice activist. And I first want to make a pitch in case anyone is unaware of resilience.org as a place where this conversation does happen, and that's very much to the credit of the Post-Carbon Institute, because you can read Rob Hopkins there, you can read Richard's work there, you can read a lot of the stuff.
And yours, John, as well.
We could say that I'm not the only one talking about climate justice and social movements there, and I think that's a very good meeting place. And I'd like to see it here, too. I'd like to see Transition and the Post-Carbon Institute think about their relationships with, say, 350.org, the climate mobilization, a whole set of justice movements, climate justice movements, because as you said, the science and the physics of it is daunting. And so we need to do things well, but quickly. Mm-hmm. And I think social movements are a way to do that. And I think that the beauty of transition is that it offers an alternative vision, which is so much needed, because we need hope. We need to involve younger people, and their creativity and their energy and their imagination are big parts of the solution. So I just put it out there, and I wonder if you have anything to say about your relationship to the climate justice movement, to organizations like what 350 does and the climate mobilization.
Sure. Yeah, I think it's really important to support each other's work. I'm on the board of advisors for the climate mobilization. That's not it. You said it. My brain just had a. And 350.org. My brain is just gone. Who's the head of 350? Bill McKibben. He's one of our post-carbon fellows. So we try to support his work every way we can. And I just think it's, there aren't that many of us really. I mean, you take all of those organizations together, including Transition, and it's still, not a huge, big bunch of people. So the last thing we want to do is work at cross purposes to one another, or to say, my organization is the important one and all the rest of you really don't get it. I have no time for that whatsoever. I think all of those folks are doing great work, and I'm delighted to lend a hand whenever I can. So, thank you.